the kinds of things that I do to the question about understanding the human condition. I think as sciences go, psychology is in a fairly good place to say something about the human condition, and that's part of what presents this link into the rest of CLA and the rest of the humanities. So I am a personality psychologist fundamentally. I'm interested in what are the major components of people's personalities and where they come from. And some of my research is focused on what are the consequences of having different personality traits, but more of it is focused on what the sources of those personality traits might be. And that's both in terms of psychological processes, but also in terms of brain function and what kind of brain systems are involved in producing different patterns of personality and different personality traits. I've always thought of psychology as sort of a bridge between the humanities and the biological sciences. And I think, well, you can see that partly just in the kind of trajectory of my own intellectual development. When I went to college, what I was interested in was much more oriented toward the humanities. I was interested in philosophy, I was interested in literature, and I was interested in history. And certainly I was interested in all of those things in part as a way to understand people. What makes people tick? Why am I the way that I am? Why am I different from other people? I didn't yet realize at that point that there was actually a branch of psychology that focused exactly on those kinds of questions, and that's personality psychology. But it took me a while to kind of transition over into the sciences. So my major as an undergraduate was actually in the history of science. And one of the rules of that major was that whatever science you were studying historically, you actually had to take some current classes in as well. And so I was studying the history of psychology and psychiatry, and I ended up taking basically a minor's worth of psychology and got more and more interested in that. So then by the time I finished my BA, I decided I want to study psychology from a scientific perspective, not a historical perspective. I went to graduate school in a psychology program that was focused on personality. But somehow I kept getting farther and farther into the sort of harder and harder sciences, as it were. I started working with molecular genetic data when I was in grad school. It was right around when people were starting to get access to actual data about people's DNA, and we thought, oh, maybe we can link this in interesting ways to people's personalities. Then in my postdoctoral work, after I got my PhD, but before I got my job here, I was trained to do MRI research, so brain scanning. And that's what most of my research here in my lab is now. We look at people's brains, their structure, their function in the MRI scanner, and try to link it to differences in personality that people display. But even along this trajectory into sort of the more and more biological neuroscience end of things, I've always thought that psychology was fundamentally the point for me. Because the point is not just to understand brain function, the point is to understand human function and human experience. So I've always thought of neuroscience as something that could, well, first it can constrain our psychological ideas, because I think that any psychological theory should be consistent with what we know about how the brain works. And then it can also inform them. And I think the example that Valerie brought up is one really nice way in which neuroscience, basic neuroscience research, even in animals, sometimes informs how we understand human psychological function. Like the identification of distinct brain systems that make us enjoy things versus that make us desire things is really important for understanding how those things are separated and separable psychologically. So that you can understand someone like an addict who continues to pursue a drug even when taking it no longer gives them enjoyment, but they feel that they need it and they still want it, and that's part of the problem of addiction. I think neuroscience really can help with understanding these sort of basic issues about the human condition. And then I guess the last thing that I'll say is when I say that I think psychology acts like a bridge, it's not just because it was sort of a gateway drug for me into the neurosciences out of the humanities, but also because I think that in a deeper way, it connects something, well, it has to do fundamentally with the difference that I see between what the humanities do and what the sciences do, right? This science has, the scientific method is sort of unusually suitable for trying to understand the facts of the world. But as Valerie's favorite philosopher Hume pointed out, it can't tell us what to value. It can't tell us how to create meaning for ourselves in life. And that's really what the humanities are for, in my view, to explore meaning, to explore value. And history is kind of interesting. Maybe it's sort of a bridge too, because there's a concern for fact as well as meaning in history. But I see psychology as the science that is allowing us to tap into an understanding of how people create meaning and how people create value, even if it can't tell us exactly which ones should be created or adopted. And then that understanding of the way that people work hopefully can let us help people to have more fulfilling lives, to help people clinically, but also even just personally. I always hope that my students in my classes take out not just a set of facts that they've memorized, but also some kind of new perspective on their own personalities and how to navigate through their lives that might be informed by psychological research, which is itself informed by neuroscience.
So I wanted to focus my comments around three different notions. That of neuroscience being something of a missing link, of issues around how do we even measure this stuff, and also a mismatch that makes our grasp short of our reach. But I think a place to start is really with zombies. And how we are really taken by this, the aim of all these zombies is to get a hold of these brains. And brains, we can relate to that. We have a cultural fetish around the brain. And I look forward very much to how Jan is coming to grips with that. But I think we are here because there's some aspect of mystery and yet some aspect of power that's wrapped up in this bundle of neurons that we're carrying around inside of our skull. And one of the reasons that so much attention has come to this particular organ is because it sits at a really unique place in our levels of analysis of how the universe works, from the subatomic level up through our atoms, compounds and proteins and genes, and then how those begin to manifest themselves in various biological organisms. And then somewhere up here, we're having conversations and we're having policies and we're having large macro scale kinds of phenomena that we are describing. Somewhere in there, this miracle happens, which is that those things, there's a level of the brain at which all kinds of remarkable things happen that are difficult to account for. And was sort of for the longest time was a black box in this hierarchy of levels of analysis. And really in the last 20 or 30 years, we begin to penetrate that with a rapidity that has been unprecedented historically. And that gaze has allowed us to make connections between lower levels of analysis and higher levels of analysis. And one of the things I think is really important as we do that is that this is not simply about a process of being reductionistic. It's a process that shows sort of the unity of those different levels of analysis. So for example, it is not the neurons in my prefrontal cortex that decide for me that I'm going to come to the theater this afternoon. In fact, it was a request by a colleague, and then that had a manifestation at a neural level. So a reductionist account is completely insufficient to account for how those levels of analysis draw together. And so as we try to understand the meaning of the brain, it's going to be this two-way street that goes up and down and facilitates our understanding of relationships between genes and larger things like reading literature to committing crimes. But one of the things that has occurred with that is that we struggle with the idea of the brain being measured objectively. And I once had a colleague who was a very senior colleague who had seen the highs and lows of psychology over the course of his career, and there was this new neuroscience thing that had come into the department. And he visited one of our MRI group meetings, and he came out of that just shaking his head like, you guys got the same problems the rest of us do. You got the issues of reliability, you've got issues of confounds, you've got, here was a person who was deeply steeped in the issues of measurement of behavior, who had come to realize that we can't give these, just because we're using an MRI or we're using a CT scan or we're using one of these really fancy devices, we still have errors of measurement. We still have issues of statistical inference and so on and so forth. And so there's a way in which we need to take this brain that's on a pedestal and sort of realize how squishy and how flawed it can be in trying to understand itself. And finally, I want to anticipate a discussion about the realization of the hopes that have come along with the age of being able to measure the brain with increasing accuracy. And that is that we're still suffering from a fundamental mismatch. We're able to measure down to a sub-millimeter level what the structures are, how neurons are interacting with each other. But we can't, in disease, manipulate at that level. So we're at that awkward point in medicine where we can measure things better than we can do anything about them. The level at which psychiatry intervenes is generally pharmacologic, right? And pharmacologic manipulations are systemic. And the more we learn about the brain, the more we learn about how those pharmacologic manipulations go everywhere in the brain. We talk about side effects of medication. That's just a polite name for effects of medication, right? That we don't want. And so we are. There's a promise like, oh, you know that this system is involved, that this connection between various areas are involved in a particular form of pathology or addiction. My domain is looking at psychosis in particular, and how beliefs are formed and how people behave in a disorganized manner. But we can learn all this, but we haven't gotten particularly good at pulling the levers to get those things under control. So there's a fundamental frustration that comes along with simply being able to measure. I want to end my comments there.
You are doing very well at sticking to the time you allotted. I'm really impressed. Jan.
Do we get to sit down there so we?
You might want to.
Yeah.
You might want to.
I want pictures.
But you have to come back.
Oh. I thought this was my big chance.
So I've timed this at 10 minutes. So if I cut off in the images, I'm going to try to pay attention to that. And this first one will hold a little bit longer so I can set it up, what you're looking at. And I invite you to pay close attention to any judgments that come up, any attraction, any thoughts about what you're seeing, and just keeping that in the background as you're moving through the images, because I'm going to continue to talk and not speak directly to the images. But they are images of my brain that I collected from working with the colleagues in Wilma Kustal in Shanghai in the psychology department. A number of years ago, they were studying semantic processing in the brain, and I was very interested to be a collaborator on that, and the images are collected from a pilot study. So I then took those images and inverted the data, and so black went to white, and blue went to yellow, and then I used those as a catalyst for my subjective response to them with different material. But at the outset, you'll just be looking at the straight up images. Okay? Very good. So it's always intriguing to me to know how I fit in with the scientists in the room. And I too want to tell a story. I think one of the great things about the humanities, it places human stories at the center of our research, right? And it has a number of means for articulating those stories. I've moved through a number of fields within the humanities and ended up in art. I think it's the most expansive field, and thus it's the greatest field for inviting the whole person to the table, all of us to the table, the mind, the body, the spirit, the emotion, all of us to the table. So, but I got there when I went to college. I was a pre-med biology major. I was enamored completely with the sciences, and I can still remember, I was a shy, quiet girl, and I still remember that day in high school, AP biology, lucky me, we got fetal pigs, right? And the smell was disgusting, and the feel of it was kind of gross, but when I could kind of move up one layer from my olfactory, sensual sort of experience of that, and slice through the skin, and peel back that skin, slice through the connective tissue, the fascia, the muscle going into the cavity, the viscera, the organs. It was the most exciting thing that had happened to me. And I thought, this is it. There's something here. I desperately wanted to understand my life, and I went straight for the detail in matter. And that's where I lived for a little while. And I didn't know very much and realized I didn't have the temperament to be a doctor, and I didn't understand you could go into neuro research or anything like that, but doctoring was going to be off the table. So I started taking art classes. That's not the most practical thing in the world. That was a really strong impetus for me to have a practical profession. Philosophy and art weren't going to give me that. Doctoring would have, but doctoring doesn't fit. What do I do? In my last semester, I took a philosophy class, Existentialism in Literature, and it blew my mind wide open. I was not drawn to literature. I was not drawn to politics or history. I really liked drawing, and I really liked my science studies. I was quite content, but I was really ignorant. I didn't have much of a grasp of the impact of language, writing, these human stories that are so central to my life now. They weren't really in my field at that time, and I'm telling a very personal story because I think that's what humanities allows us to do, art in particular. But I took that first class in philosophy and understood that this is a field of knowledge that will help me understand, in a way that my science studies couldn't, what it is to be human, why I'm here, how do we know what we know, how do we know what's true, how do we know what's real, how do we dismantle like these systems of oppression that are like everywhere in the world. This was just beginning to be known to me, and philosophy was this amazing tool that was going to help me learn what that was. And so I went deeply into philosophy and got my PhD and started teaching philosophy, and then the through line from this story is I'm always looking for greater and greater integration, more wholeness, more parts of me brought to the table. And so for me in the field of philosophy, I tended to over-intellectualize almost everything and started to be aware of that, right? And I needed the body back. I started drawing again. I was writing my dissertation. I was secretly painting in the basement. Nobody knew except for my advisor, except for my dissertation advisor. But it wasn't taken seriously, and by parts of me as well. This was an alienated part of kind of who I was at that point, right? But a deep, a strong part and a subconscious part, and started to come out through the painting. And I thought, I need to be an artist. That's what I need to do. And so I got a job in philosophy teaching part-time in Chicago, and went to graduate school in fine art and studied that. And after that, I became an editor of an arts magazine and started writing about art. That's how I was getting closer and closer to really making art more full-time and pursuing this connection between the human condition and how we know what that is, right? And best ways to express that. And after many years in Chicago teaching philosophy, writing about art, I got this job here in an art department and kind of fully moved into being a visual artist most of my time, the majority of my time. So moving from science to philosophy. So science as a pre-med undergrad was this kind of very material, somewhat reductive, fascinating investigation of the body, moving into mind, highly cultivated thinking mind, that feeling the kind of limitations of that, moving into art, which is bringing me back to the body, back to material, back to this personal expression, integrating. Art is this most permissive, wonderful field that lets you blend the conceptual with the emotional, the mind with the body, the rational with the intuitive. Like, it can hold it all, right? And lately, I've been bringing in somatic practices and contemplative practices, looking for greater union. And so I've started incorporating yoga into my teaching practice and also into my art practice. Yoga, the yoking of mind, body, spirit, soul, like all of it coming together. So that's my kind of very simplistic version of the through line. And what's interesting to me about connecting with the sciences again as an artist is I too came to this field like wanting to know like what's true, what's real, and given my disposition to sort of be enamored of the sciences, looking for an answer there, often looking first there. And yet, these images leave so much out, right? Every one of us that says this today, we've sort of complained and respected the reductionist way that science is pursued, right? It can't treat the whole person. That's not its purview. Like, it's got this incredible focus, but it is focused, and that focus delivers, but it's limited, right? So how do we incorporate the broader context? And what you're looking at, these images, a very simple analogy is I'm taking that substrate of quote-unquote objective anatomical physical data, the brain scan, and I'm inserting all that's left out, right? In a highly idiosyncratic, subjective way, right? That is also limited, right, to this body-mind, this way. But art, too, can be very hard-edged and reductionist and simplistic, as any field can. But at its best, it's most expansive, right? And it allows more of this to be represented. And so when I first was involved with this group on campus, the methodologies are so radically different, right? And your methodology, your research methodology shapes what the outcome is, right? And so each of us is drawn in different ways to do our thinking and being in the world, right? Some are going to be drawn to the hard scientists, some are going to be drawn to the kind of something like psychology that could be bridging the hard science and humanities, and some of us are drawn to the humanities. And I'm also interested in the way that, as a yogi, some of the neuroscientific findings, particularly the research on trauma and the effects of trauma on the nervous system and the brain, how that is validating what the yogis have known for centuries, right? That by training the mind, we can affect the brain, we can affect personality traits, they're sort of discovering that. And in that, we can change human behavior, right? It's not a one-stop thing. It takes lots and lots of practice to do that. But there's a way, and I use this, I'm developing, it's the second year I've taught it, a class on campus, a freshman seminar, art and yoga, where we're combining contemplative and somatic practices, yoga and meditation, chanting, with creative practices of all sorts, and we're combining that in a kind of extended seminar-type format. So we're moving into a mindful state before we're working with the creative material, And it's for non-artists, it's not for professionals, right? It's hitting people, especially freshmen who are so responsive to this class. It's hitting them at the very basic level, and kind of asking them to develop this kind of mindful, contemplative practice and a creative practice as tools to understand their mind-body, their story, their unconscious as it manifests through these creative acts, right? And so as a kind of way to get them to do the practices, which can feel very strange if you're not used to living in your body, these embodied practices can be very strange. I rely on these jazzy, cool scientific studies that, look, they're showing that this kind of activity really does have impact. Try it out for yourself, right? And so it just helps kind of gives a very practical, utilitarian reason to do something that's a little bit odd, that might feel odd. And then it's their job to try it out for themselves. This is the grand experiment, right? So I noticed that my images are stopped, so I've got to stop talking.
Why don't we just take 1 minute to thank the 3 people who
Oh, that's my puppy.
the people who had to prepare.
That's right.
So I want to ask, I have a few questions I want to ask, and maybe while I'm asking and hopefully you are answering, the people in the audience can think about whether you have questions of your own, because we certainly have time for that, and I think that would be great. So Colin, you mentioned, you had the metaphor of the bridge, that neuroscience is a bridge between...
Psychology is a bridge, I was saying.
Sorry, psychology is a bridge between the humanities and the hard sciences. I guess I was thinking, I was wondering how much you and Angus, given what the two of you said, how much you're on the same page. And the way it seems to me is, if you look at neuroscience in particular, the bridge isn't finished and it doesn't go everywhere, right? So the bridge, I think Angus's point was, where we want the bridge to go is to tell us, here is what the brain is like, and therefore, here are the things that you can do to make yourself whole and healthy and happy. And we don't have the practical part worked out yet. Perhaps we don't even have the knowledge part worked out yet completely. And then Colin, you made the point that there are questions about meaning and value that those types of tools are not, they're just not designed to answer those sorts of problems. So I guess I wonder, are you both, does that sound right to both of you, or do you actually, are there some disagreements between the two of you lurking?
We disagree all the time. Our
At
offices
faculty meetings, right?
are just down the hall from each other, and there's blood on the floor.
From my own perspective, I think we are fairly much in accord in the way that we're thinking about this. I mean, I'm sure we could come up with some points of disagreement if we had to, but I think that Angus is right that there's this tendency to fetishize neuroscience and images of brains. There's a great scientific paper that was published by a team of people that included my postdoc mentor, Jeremy Gray. And what they were showing was that if you take the exact same information and you present it to people just sort of in the public, and if you include a picture of a brain scan in it, people think that the information is more valid, more scientific, more well justified, right? And in fact, it's just identical, except there's this picture of a brain involved, right? So there's clearly some way in which the brain has this zombie-like draw for people in our culture as evidence that we are getting to the truth of the matter, and that it's now a really scientific understanding of why doing yoga might change your experience. But what's important, I think, is really the experience, right, and what's going on for you personally. And I think that there are some really pernicious effects of this in mental health care. For example, in the National Institute of Mental Health has put a real emphasis in their funding on research that is aimed at neurobiology and aimed at neuroscience research. You know, and I probably shouldn't say this because they like to find the kind of research that I do as long as I'm studying people who have mental health problems, right? And so, but I think that there is a lot of evidence that we know things about how to treat people behaviorally that is more effective often than treating them through drugs. And as Angus pointed out, we can't just go in and zap particular synapses yet, and who knows whether we'll ever be able to. I definitely think that, you know, although I really value neuroscience as a source of information for psychological understanding, I think that there are dangers in putting too much weight on it.
Jan, what are you thinking about the idea that, like, what if we could someday manipulate the synapses rather than having to do yoga poses and all that effort of meditating and learning the practices? I mean, would that be an improvement?
Well, yeah, no. There's oh gosh, I don't know the exact study because I read all sorts of stuff and I don't retain it because it's not my field. But there's some study that if there's a certain brain wave that when you kind of that you can induce by just surrounding yourself, like if you can induce that brain wave, you feel calmer. I'm like, well, sure, I'd like to feel calmer. I'd like to walk around with a bubble of that brainwave around me most of the time. And if there's like a very effective way where you just go in and zap me and I'm calm, and it doesn't take away my ability to have emotional responses to the world, I'd love it. I'd love it. It wouldn't take away from what we're doing, but that doesn't exist, right? And I think that it's that kind of like easy fix that people turn to drugs, and I've been on some of those mental health drugs, so I'm not, you know, when you need them, you need them. And so I'm not like, it's not a slam against that, but it's not as quick fix as you think it is, right? In yoga and meditation have done far more for me behaviorally, like you said, than these pharmacological interventions. So yeah, we want things, you know, including myself. Like if there were a way I wouldn't have to be patient and commit the time I do, I commit a lot of time to yoga and meditation. An extreme amount of time, and that is a priority because it's very effective.
I guess I'm wondering, and maybe Angus, you might be the person to speak to this, but to what extent is it, it's just a matter of time, and eventually you folks will be able to give Jan the bubble that she wants, or to what extent are there the kind of integration and wholeness that Jan was talking about, to what extent is there always going to be gaps between what a neuroscientist can do and what normal people like us want?
Yeah. So there's a lot that goes in there. So you're inviting me to get all Star Trek on you. And,
Definitely.
And there's an element of the Matrix here. Would you like the red pill? Or so one of the things is I said that I was frustrated, and I encourage us all to be comfortable with frustration. It is certainly the case that whatever progress we make, we'll be aware of the space there is of to the imaginable from the possible, and there will always be a large green field between the imaginable and the possible. And so I don't doubt that. There are remarkable advances that give us alternatives to pharmacology that are available. And I think that ancient practices are certainly one of them. Yoga, mindfulness, meditation. But you brought up another one, which is biofeedback. And biofeedback is not the latest thing off the ship. People have been using a kind of biofeedback, which is peripheral temperature for, a good part of the past century. But being able to look at brain waves and have a sense of what those brain waves are associated with, and being able to train, however that takes effort, right? train yourself to enhance some brain waves and manipulate the pattern of what's dominant is something that, for example, is becoming increasingly possible or increasingly used in children with ADHD and perhaps other disorders as well. We're just beginning to evaluate a very controversial domain. A lot of people in the room may be familiar with what used to be called electroshock therapy, right? Which we've all got one flew over the cuckoo's nest, heebie-jeebies going down our spines here. But in fact, that is a way in which people have intervened with chronic depression as well as other disorders. And we're beginning to look at how, and other people have looked at this for more than a decade, so don't mean to imply that we're like on the bleeding edge, although maybe the cutting edge, how a small microamp electronic current applied to the outside of the skull can facilitate learning, can facilitate the extent to which you can do more with your prefrontal cortex. And I don't know if our experiment will work. Other people have found things that do work. Others have said, no, they don't work. We have a good reason to think that it might work. But if it does, and if that tends to be what we learn, it's like, well, why didn't evolution do this for us? It's going to raise new questions about, well, if this is so great, why didn't we just change our neuronal thresholds by a little bit? What are we getting and what are we giving up? And I think the question of what are we getting and what are we giving up is going to be rife with the kinds of manipulations that you're talking about. If we make it easier, what have we given up in accepting that ease? And humanists will be able to struggle with that.
Yeah, right, because those are questions about value. I mean, whether, is what we're giving up important, right? Yeah. Are there so far questions from the audience that anyone would like to ask? I can only see you if I go like this. Yeah.
Yeah, I want to ask you, when you ask the question, you say what neuroscience can do for normal people like us, for what we want. But you mentioned that you were working with psychosis. I want to ask you, what is that neuroscience, or do you think that can be doing in the future, near future, for people suffering from psychosis or schizophrenia?
Well, maybe I can take on some of those at the same time. Some of the work that I'm doing involves examining persecution and persecutory ideation. One of the most common symptoms in schizophrenia, as well as other related disorders, is the feeling that people, right? Not just the world in general, but people are out to get you. And that's kind of remarkable, particularly when you think of how much trouble people would be willing to go through to get you. I mean, I worked with one patient who had taken out all of his teeth. He had taken out all of his teeth because he was afraid that they had been drilled out and had little transmitters put in. Not all at once, one at a time, making it all the more inconvenient for whoever was doing this. And so he was able to maintain a sense that the world was a place that was really, that was not just, malevolent, but was willing to really go out of its way to make things tougher for him. And however, that you don't need to have psychosis to think that the world has it in for you. In fact, there's a regular proportion of the population that has a lot of difficulty building relationships, maintaining, trusting others, And that's a critical aspect of the social fabric. It's a critical aspect. Being able to trust is an essential element of human capital that allows us to work together in a society. In one of the things that's been quite difficult is actually finding manipulations that allow us to understand other people's impact on ourselves and how we make decisions that are relevant to other people. And so I think one of the ways in which we're pushing back against that ignorance is by understanding what brain areas need to be connected up to be able to allow us to trust one another. And ultimately, whether it comes down to doing brain exercises, like practicing those connections, or whether or not those connections have to do with a nutritional kind of change, or whether, pharmacology is going to solve it all. And notice that there are a few different ways in which we can come at manipulating connections between different brain areas. But that would be something that maybe have its biggest impact in the domain of people with schizophrenia and other psychoses, but may also be helpful if you have a loved one in your family, or if you yourself are someone who would like to trust more, but just have this inherent reaction to other people, like, does that help?
Yeah.
But
Yeah, thank you. This is really engaging and interesting. The topic, as I understood it, was neuroscience and the human condition. Not a lot has been said about the human condition in this. And I'm wondering if I can pose a question about how neuroscience and the cognitive sciences more broadly and generally might deal with a relationship in the human condition that is, in a sense, inverting the implicit causal direction in our conversation, right? We've talked about the reductionist tendencies and impulses, so forth, but in some respects we've recapitulated that, right? That is, it's the brain that's doing the stuff, and then it may have some consequences out there. I'm wondering whether in existing neuroscience developments, there's much that is thinking about, for want of a better term, sort of downward causation, right? That is, how it is that the human condition is shaping how brains function, right? How is it that in our intense post-industrial, late capitalist era, human brains may function differently? And so neuroscience is a different creature than it may have been for pre-modern human beings and so forth. Is there any openness to that counter-reductionist kind of move to think about how the human condition implants itself on brains?
Sure, yeah, I think that there's definitely a movement in neuroscience in general, and especially as it connects to psychology, to try to understand the phrase that is often used is how the environment out there gets under the skin, right? And so how the kind of world that we live in and the experiences that we have ends up actually affecting our body and affecting our brains. So that is clearly an example of this kind of causation that you're talking about. So I think that there is definitely a sense that this is a two-way street, and that a lot of the organization of the brain and the mind are emergent, right? They require this complex interaction between whatever information is encoded genetically, but then the environment in which that individual is developing. We no longer really have the kind of simplistic biological causal view of the genetic code as a blueprint in which exactly what's going to be is somehow laid down. It's not. It's actually essentially a set of instructions that can only come to fruition in their interaction with an environment, and with the environment within the body and in the world as a whole. So one example I thought of while you were asking your question was something known as the Flynn Effect, which is in the study of intelligence and IQ tests. It was discovered at some point that in relatively industrialized and developed countries, IQ was rising over time. And this had been missed for a long time because of the fact that IQ tests are always calibrated so that the average in the population is 100 and the standard deviation is 15 points. And they recalibrate them every once in a while to make sure they're still operating the same way. Well, someone got the clever idea, and his name was Flynn, Jim Flynn. That's why it's called the Flynn Effect, of going back to the actual raw scores on the tests. He found an archive in which he could actually track the raw scores over a number of decades. And what he saw was that essentially with every generation, people were gaining on average in the population about 5 points of IQ. And this has now been studied all over the world, and it seems to be something that happens whenever you have a culture that is sufficiently sort of developed and industrialized. There's actually just some recent research suggesting that in the last couple of decades, the effect may have stopped in some of the most highly complex and developed societies. But
apps don't allow us to go further.
Right, or maybe the apps, or maybe they're making us stupid. But I think that's a really interesting and fascinating example of exactly what you said, is that the underlying, because anything that is psychological at some level has to be a product of what the brain is doing. We just don't always understand the way that those things interrelate, right? And so somehow the different environments that we lived in over time with industrialization and economic development actually changed the way that our brains functions, and at least for a while anyway, made us smarter.
I want to highlight just something that came up while you were asking your question, which is, in fact, I think we're sort of going out of our way to critique a reductionist account of neuroscience. And there must be some way in which our habitual way of speaking and our habitual way of thinking about causation makes that harder to hear. Because I think certainly for myself, I see it as not just a two-way street, but there are more lanes coming in from the environment, 3 lanes coming in, maybe 2 or 1.5 lane going out. So it's certainly asymmetrical. Our organisms are designed to be able to cope with what might come with us, and so what's coming in needs to be really important. But I wanted to highlight a way of asking that question that's particularly University of Minnesota-esque, which is to take the twin study design. And we think of, the twin study design, that's going to tell me about how heritable something is, how much it has to do with my genes, right? We'll stop right there. Because the other thing you can do with a twin study is you can say, what is causing these two people to be different? These two people that have the same genetic makeup to be different. And some of the work that the Minnesota Center for Twin Family Research, as well as a collaboration that I have with them, is asking that question. Okay, let's take these monozygotic twins that are, some of which are quite similar, and some of which are quite different. And we know a lot about things like, alcohol consumption, for example. How is that causing them to behave differently? How is that causing their brains to appear different in a scanner, even knowing that developmentally the organism was very similar in terms of its family environment and so forth? What are the differences in the experiences between those two people, the differences in the substances that they've used and so forth, and how might they be drawing these two organisms into these two very similar organisms when they were born in very different directions?
And I think just to add to that, the studies are clear that long-term meditators, they're changing their brain. That practice affects the brain. So it does go back and forth how this works. Mm-hmm. But, yeah.
And that's some of the most long-term research in cognitive neuroscience and use of scanners that's been going on. The Dalai Lama was definitely an early person who was collaborating with cognitive neuroscience to say, we've got all of these practices. What on earth are they? Are they doing at another level of analysis? We know what they're doing in other ways.
And it really is this age-old question of how the immaterial and the material connect. How does consciousness and the mind and the brain connect? That's a really odd connection. They're of different stuff, right? And so it gets very tricky to kind of document that, study that. And,
Do you have any llamas in the twin data pool?
That's right, we should.
John?
Trying to ask this. We'd like to point to the social some sense of scientific progress. And your senior colleague, notwithstanding, who pointed out the differential problems, cursor dimensionality, and so on. I still want to believe there's progress in the psych department. I'm you just had your 100-year history, so I'm just going to take that as a given and turn to Jan. Is this progress, humanities, to achieve this greater synthesis that you're talking about, this better conception of the whole person? And would someone who did art at the university 50 years ago, now looking at your images and your enterprise, say, we've made, probably progress is the wrong word, but how do we evaluate 50 years of work in art against the breakthrough you're describing? Or is it all interpersonal?
Yeah, it's curious, the notion of progress, that we're always on this upward trajectory, you know? I often think of mastery in the arts, because there's a very traditional way that we understand what mastery is. It's finely honing an understanding of material and craft. And we still have those kinds of masters in the arts, right? They really know how to work wood, or to paint, or to whatever kind of material commitment they've made. There's a depth of experience that allows for mastery, and then that mastery is taught and shared with others. That's not the mastery I aspire to, and there are a lot of artists that I'm teaching that's not their model of mastery. It's an honorable one, and we have we have professors that educate in that way, but it's more, to speak very broadly, it's a mastery of the human condition. It's a mastery of wisdom, a certain kind of wisdom that comes from, again, within the visual arts particular, and literary arts as well, combining that lived, embodied, very personal subjective experience into material form, right? And meeting of the mind and the body in a specific object or gesture or song or piece of writing. And that mastery, yeah, we all could benefit from greater mastery in that particular kind of wisdom, right? I would say that.
I'd like to add something to that, and it has to do with a thought that I had while you were talking, actually. Because when you said that science can't address the whole person, the job of art is to be able to address the whole person. And that was amusing to me, because there's a fairly common saying in personality psychology, which is that compared to other areas of psychology, the mandate of personality psychology is to understand the whole person. And there's another saying attributable to Bill Revell that personality psychology is the last refuge of the generalist in psychology. So, and that's, I think, part of why it appeals to me, is that I have this kind of interest in integration and synthesis in a way that seems similar to what you're expressing. And the thing that I was thinking about, okay, so what is the difference, right? I mean, there is a way in which art obviously can do something, and the humanities can do things that science, even psychology, cannot. And so I thought that maybe one way to express the difference is that personality psychology, at its best, its aspiration, might be able to understand the whole person, but what art allows is for the expression of the whole person, right? And for the individual to find that expression of themselves and their individuality. So to me, it seems maybe that something like progress in art is its ability to keep up with the time, right? To find the modes of expression that are actually suitable to the time, suitable to each individual, but within their own cultural context. And that's constantly changing and constantly developing. So it's not like it can ever sit still, right?
And I love that I had the thought about Valerie's work too, because I could say that philosophy also can be very reductive in a way, but she does moral psychology, right, which is about the lived experience. So I think when we speak in these broad generalizations about a field, like I'm very hesitant to speak for all art. I can't do that, right? But I can speak to what I know, and I'll gladly do that, right, as long as I put that qualification in. So, but yeah. Generalism.
When you first asked that question and Jan started to speak, I thought, oh, thank God she's the panelist, and I don't need to answer that question about the humanities. But then as the two of you are talking, now suddenly I can't resist jumping in, even though I don't know if that's an appropriate thing for a moderator to do. But the idea that, so if I think about what I'm doing when I teach my students, I probably wouldn't use the word mastery. It sounds a little grand to me, but to get them to develop a practice where they can ask really big questions and make progress in thinking through those questions by themselves or with each other, not in the classroom, not only in the classroom. That's what I want for them. And that's it's a practice that you can be better or worse at, this sort of self-reflection and reflection. Really, it is, I guess, reflection on what it is to be a person in community with other people. And there's not gonna be progress in that exactly. There is for each individual student, but we're not gonna figure that out because the answer shifts as our environments shift. And so I guess I like what both of you said about that. It sounded kind of right to me. I don't know how satisfied John is with the.
So we understand what later Wittgenstein was saying, but we haven't made any progress in mind-body problems.
Oh, so I guess I also think.
Because we use this metric of progress in the social sciences all the time, and we want to say what they're doing in psych today would, B.F. Skinner would just be agog, right, because of this, and all the accomplishments and all the new data and all the new measurement.
Or disgusted, one of the two.
You never know with that guy.
But in the humanities, I think people really resist this idea of taking this metric and moving it over to them and saying, we're making progress. Are you making progress? And of course, maybe we aren't. But I always am told you can't evaluate our enterprise in those terms. It's something we're doing something different. We may understand Wittgenstein better, but the idea of resolving mind-body problems is not the way we work. We don't. Is that fair, or is it?
Yeah, I guess I think there are some big, huge, deep philosophical questions that the point of thinking about them is not really to resolve them. That said, I'm thinking of what Jan said about not speaking for all artists and there being a kind of, you talked about the sort of mastery involved in mastering a craft. And I think there are areas of philosophy where progress has certainly been made. We've put certain kinds of arguments and moves out of commission. And I think that kind of progress, which would be more familiar to a social scientist, is happening more in the areas where philosophy is starting to connect with the sciences. So there are certain things that Kant said about our rational capacities that my opinion is we just know those things to be false. And so if you're going to be a follower of Kant, you have to interpret carefully and rethink some of the claims. So I think there is sort of straightforward kinds of progress. I just don't think that's what's most exciting about philosophy. But, yeah.
I have a question. I'm wondering if all of you would be willing to comment on attention, and maybe it's not even attention, but what I think and what I've heard in terms of scientific process is understanding mechanisms. So if we only knew how neurons give rise to behavior, or which synapse is important for what, psychopathology, we would be able to help more. And so and in psychology too, with the reproducibility crisis and things like that, there's an effect on turning towards mechanism and theory rather than effects-based, seeing that one thing, we change this and we get a better outcome. But I wonder if that almost causes us to go into a more reductive state where we lose sight of the fact a benefit is a benefit even if we don't know why. So yoga still is a good practice even if we don't know exactly how it and why and the mechanism behind how it's beneficial. And I'm wondering in terms of progress and how we help the human condition versus how we understand truth. How do we balance those tensions? Or how do you balance those?
Mechanism's a magical word, and
Sort of mechanical, too.
it is. I've heard that. So first off, when I was just in a meeting this morning where we were talking about mechanisms and so forth. And you almost want to say underlying mechanism, right? So what that leads to is that one person's mechanism is another person's hand waving, depending on what their perspective, what level of analysis most of their work is around. So on the one hand, it's a sort of gold plating that we put on whatever we're doing to make it particularly shiny. And so, you know, if you're writing a grant and you're not talking about mechanisms, you're probably less likely to get funded than if you'd said the same thing and talked about mechanisms. It also has a sense of causality in it without having to actually necessarily demonstrate causality, because you're exploring the mechanism. And so that leaves us in a rather fraught state. So when you say we don't understand the mechanism behind yoga, well, kind of we do. Kind of we do. And of course, kind of we don't. And so again and again, whenever there are more questions about how something becomes instantiated, whenever there are more questions at a different level of analysis, there will always be a question about the mechanism. However, that's one of those rabbits that's worth chasing, even if we know we'll never catch it.
Nanette?
Yeah. So I was really struck, Colin, by your analogy of a bridge.
Mm-hmm.
And then as I heard Angus talking, and I was thinking, where's my bridge to this? Right? As someone who's really in the humanities, where's my bridge to what you're talking about? And then Jan's images came up.
Mm-hmm.
And then when you started to use the words, and I know a bit about your work,
Mm-hmm.
when she started to use the words, the bridge for me about what you were talking about was made. Right? So I started to see, okay, I'm understanding why it's so important that we have that whole person brought into the work that you're doing, right? It was such a beautiful visual representation of what exactly was happening on the panel. You're talking about brain function and all of these things that we know about the brain, and saying we have to bring the whole person, we have to think about that. And then Jan so beautifully brought that in, and I thought, okay, that's what we need, right? We have all this understanding, or we're gaining more understanding about brain function and so on, but we still need the humanities. We still need to be able to talk about it, to use the words, to visualize it. It isn't just about the brain scan. It has to be more than that. It was really such a beautiful moment for me to be able to see, okay, there's my bridge.
Right, to make it meaningful and to make it connect to the human and to people's
Exactly.
lived experience.
Right,
Yeah.
there's my bridge to that. Thank you for that. Thank you.
I want to make a comment on that as well, because it's interesting that you picked up on the words. What suddenly was making those connections for me was when liquid started coming out of the various parts, and that was hugely powerful and to me in terms of linking neural systems with the world around, and with different emotional reactions, and with just other kinds of things that have to do with, be it perspiration or tears or blood.
I mean, it's kind of amazing, and Colin mentioned this, that what's great and fundamental to art is expression, right? However that manifests, however conceptual or intuitive that manifests, it's an expression of this experience. And I very much feel that. I'm very lucky to have that as a part of my daily sense of who I am in the world, and I am super fortunate to share that with students. I think the idea of progress, so creative expression or yoga, right, it helps us understand our experience. And for me, the more people understand and are liberated from the reactivity that causes them great suffering, the more progress we're making. And if that's a role that humanities can have, that's amazing power, right? And we all can do that. We all do that in different ways at different levels. And that's not just about understanding how it works, but check it in your experience, right? How is this affecting how you feel in your body? How is this affecting how you feel relationally? How is this affecting, you know, your sense of optimism versus despair, right? And getting it out of the body, sort of away from the body, really helps get some distance from. So, I mean, that's song does that, writing does that, and visual expression does that. But, yeah.
I was curious, Jan, what your reaction was to Angus's comment about the fetishization of the brain in our current culture, and whether, for you, getting your brain scanned, which can't be that much fun, and using those images rather than pictures of the external of your body, or, you know, pictures of cells, or it's something else besides the brain. I was wondering, was it important in terms of the content of the art, or are you playing with the fetishization of it? Were you aware of that in your process?
Oh yeah, I fetishize the brain. Straight up. I'm like, a man. And it's like, it's such an expensive tool, like very few people get access. There's all sorts of like privilege and access things going on that like.
It's like going to an inner sanctum.
Yeah, total. And it, you know, I'm not, so I'm being a little facetious. I'm not exactly proud of that, but it's definitely like, it is this like, if I could look inside my brain and that would give me understanding, I'm going to try to do that. That's not how it works. That's not at all how it works, right? And I was so dependent on this whole team of people and this whole like multi-million-dollar infrastructure to have that, like, it seems very naive, but that impulse, if I could only see how this works, that would give me relief. And it doesn't. It doesn't take away all of that other stuff that's going on. And it's like by dealing with all that other stuff that I get a moment of relief, right? Again, it's the expression. But yeah, I'm having my cake and eating it too. And I also know the power of those images. And some people are very cynical about the power of those images, of like, you know, that's what makes the drawings more valuable because the science there. Right? And so it's like, okay, you can have that thought. That's why I asked you to like just pay attention to your judgments as you're moving, not good or bad, just like, what are those thoughts about the value of this kind of information, this data, right? And then what happens when you get this kind of sort of free-form, subjective drawing combined with it? What happened? What shifted? I mean, Nanette sort of had this beautiful response, but others might be very cynical in that response, like, wow. You know, so that's it. That's what we do. Right?
Yeah, Colin's example of the research that shows that if you have a picture of a brain in your paper, it's more likely to be taken. That leads to cynicism. But your art does not. I don't think it engenders cynicism. Also picking up on Nanette's comment, let me ask the two sciencey types. Do you feel like your work is influenced by, I mean, Colin, you mentioned coming from the humanities and from an interest in philosophy and literature and history. Angus, you didn't talk about it, but I'm guessing that you have some interest in those. I'm wondering how that has affected the work you do historically, or even in the moment when you're thinking about what questions to ask or what to do next or what kind of study to run. Do you find that you draw on, are you mainly drawing on other scientific papers, or do you sometimes draw on your interests or knowledge of the humanities or arts? I guess that was a tough question.
So, go ahead.
I thought you were going to start, but then it seemed like maybe you were waiting.
Oh, I thought you were saying something.
I think that there's kind of a general way in which studying something like, you know, people's personality traits, one of course draws on experience, and experience is often engaged and deepened through literature and through philosophy. And it's funny that you said that the philosophy class that you took that really inspired you was a class on existentialism, because that was true for me too. I went to a fancy high school, so I got a class in philosophy and existentialism my senior year, and that was what really propelled me to want to do philosophy when I went to college. Then I somehow managed to take a couple of boring philosophy classes, and like a typical 19-year-old, I was like, well, I need to find something else because that's not right. You know, so I had this interest in phenomenology, and in the sense that it's valuable to understand carefully what first-person experience is like. And so I think about the way in which the research that I do actually connects to that, because the most common way that we assess people's personalities is that we ask them to describe their personalities. Now, they're doing this in a standardized way, right? Because what they're doing is taking a test where there's a statement and they have to say how much this is like them or isn't like them. But nonetheless, that's kind of a stripped down and simplified first-person phenomenological methodology. And of course, we're interested not just in self-perception, but so we often also get other people to rate somebody's personality as well. But for many kinds of the characteristics that we care about, we still don't have some kind of more objective test that doesn't rely on people's perceptions of their typical patterns of behavior. And so I always think about that as sort of this remaining, lingering connection to something that I really care about, which is the value of understanding why it's like what it's like to be the person that I am, and what it's like for people to be an individual and to experience themselves, and helping people to gain more insight into that. And so I think, to me, that connects, in a real way to these more humanities-like concerns.
So I have an example that might be helpful in this. I'm probably one of the few people in the room that can tell you how much it's worth to you under particular circumstances to tell someone that you are a Catholic, or a Buddhist, or from a Muslim. And that's because, along with Penny Edgell, we were pursuing some of these questions around, I mentioned the context of studying persecution. Well, you can study the flip side of that. You can study trust. And what if you knew something about your partner? What if you knew that they were the same religion as you? Would that inspire you to trust them more? What if they were a different religion from you? Would that inspire you to trust them less? Certainly, sociology has some strong ideas about this. There's these ideas about in-group and how religions are supported due to sort of identification as a symbol of being a member of a particular group. On the other hand, if it may well be that what I know about you, if you're like me, is that you, like me, fear some sort of judgment. You fear the judgment of the Lord, you fear the impact on your karma, or maybe in our particular experiment, you could say, on the one hand, I am an atheist, and yes, I feel I will be judged in the afterlife. Yes!
How many people?
A fair proportion of atheists believe that the actions that they take in life will be judged in the afterlife. And that allows us...
Okay.
I didn't teach them atheism. That allows us to pull apart the extent to which the increase in trust, the increase in that social capital that comes with a religious practice is associated with the information that they are of the same group as I am versus the information that they fear being judged in the afterlife for actions they perform on earth. And I'll tell you, if you control for whether or not you think you're going to be judged in the afterlife, the extent to which you are of the same religion does not matter too much at all. Things come down to, in our experiment, in our trust game, we were able to show and then replicate in a series of students that were drawn from different religious and non-religious campus organizations that what was important is actually I was making a rational choice to trust you because I think that you'll be afraid of betraying me. And so that's actually infused with meaning, with hope. right? About how we can get along, about how we can, and also about how the actual mechanisms of those beliefs interact with how we can work with each other. So that has some humanity.
Is there a last question from out there? Had a lot of great questions already. In that case, let me thank you all for coming, and let us thank our panelists for a great discussion.